mics are live, so. You're ready.
Giving you down.
Sure. All right, it's 2:30. I'll call to order the Kane County CARES Act Allocation Committee. I'll ask first that our clerk call the roll, please.
Hanson,
Here.
Kenyon,
Here.
Ross,
Here.
Sanchez,
Here.
Surges, Thomas. Shape.
Here.
You have one?
All right, we have a quorum. As far as minutes are concerned, we do not have the August 3rd minutes available for approval. But we do have the August 10th minutes for approval. So I'll entertain a motion to approve the August 10th minutes. Mr. Sanchez moves, Mr. Kenyon seconds. Any additions or corrections to the minutes? Clerk, please call the roll.
Hanson,
Yes.
Kenyon,
Yes.
Yes.
Sanchez,
Yes.
and Surges, Thomas, O'Shea.
Yes. All right, minutes of August 10th are approved. Public comment, is there anyone in the audience or online that would like to address the committee this morning? Mayor Shelkey? Good afternoon.
I guess I'm hearing a couple of. I'm hearing a couple different capacities that I currently enjoy in Kane County. I'm chairman of the Kane County Council of Mayors. I am also the chairman of the Tri-City Ambulance Board, which is the ambulance service for Batavia, Geneva, and St. Charles. I also serve as chairman of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning's Council of Mayors in downtown Chicago, which includes all the cities in the area. And I will tell you that talking to mayors in other counties, everybody's kind of going through this same exercise with differing versions and differing opinions. CMAP is quite honestly, they're studying this whole thing and going to write it all down and make a kind of a history about it as to how it worked and what were the arguments and what was talked about. So we're making some history here. But the reason I'm up here today is that in talking to some of my fellow mayors, there's some questions about how we are going about counting things in Kane County. Now at CMAP, we're the ones that generate that number that a lot of people is the kind of the alternative in the middle of the census time between the 10 and 20, 2010 and 2020. There's been some adjustments to the census in most of the towns. And CMAP participates in that by virtue of a little formula they go on. But they tell me they're only doing that for the towns. They're not doing it for townships or for fire protection districts or any of these other governments. So the question I guess I come here today with is that in our case, as in Tri-City Ambulance, we have in Geneva, we do not have a fire protection district. They have a contract with the township, and the township pays some tax money to the city of Geneva every year to provide fire protection and ambulance service. In the case of Batavia, we have a legal fire protection district, which is appointed by the county board in scattered terms. And as a result of that, we are what we call a paper fire district in that we don't have any fire department. But our fire protection district, as near as we can tell at this moment, has not been counted into any number of any of the funds that are going to be credited to Batavia or Geneva for the ones that are in Geneva Township. So I'm only here to raise those questions, that there seems to be some kind of, I don't know, I'm not saying it's wrong or not saying it's a misunderstanding. I think a few things may have kind of fallen through the cracks here. And I was suggested by my fellow mayors, because there's some other areas. Unincorporated Aurora Township has a fire district down on the far southeast side of it called Aurora Township. It formerly was called Mokerville and South Park Fire Districts. So there's some of these stuffs kind of scattered around. In the case of Batavia, one of the things that's in our fire district is Mooseheart, which is the world headquarters of the Moose Lodge and their orphanage, which probably has about 350 to 400 people in it. So we've got quite a bit of population kicking around that apparently doesn't get to be accounted by anybody. So I'm just raising that issue to the committee and not firing anything at you, just bringing up the issue as we understand it. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Mayor Schilke. I do want to comment on that concern, because I think, you know, that part of the confusion may exist in by virtue of the fact that we started this process assuming that the city was going to be the recipient, and then they were going to allocate funds, whether it be for business grants, charity, or fire protection districts. And then there was concern raised by a few of the districts, including Mr. Shepro that was here on behalf of the district he represents, about the fact that they cover unincorporated areas and how would we allocate. And then based on the principles that Mr. McMahon articulated for us, we decided that to the extent possible, instead of using the city as a conduit for certain items, we would go direct with those entities. You know, the end result would be the same. The money would get there. It's just making sure it got there through the shortest route possible. And that's for auditing reasons. And so when we did our allocations of resources, we allocated to the cities certain dollar amounts, but we also created a pool for other governmental entities, and we did create a pool for fire protection districts. So I would consider that any fire department or any emergency EMS service would submit applications through that process. Now, it may be that those applications end up with requests that exceed the amount that we've allocated, and that's in part why we set up the contingency fund. So I guess what I would do at this point is encourage everyone to apply through the process, and then we can tabulate the requests in each area and see where we end up.
Well, I would just respond to that I think the cities kind of know what our per capita, you know, charge is, or what you're going to pay us. I'm not arguing that. But when you get to these fire districts that are not incorporated in the city, that's kind of a loose number that's kind of floating around out there.
And because of that, we didn't do that on a per capita basis. We did it as a lump sum of dollars for that process. And and again, I don't have this committed to memory, but I believe Mr. Shepro, when he indicated what would the needs be, or what he felt his district would need, would be somewhere less than 100,000 in the $60,000 to $80,000 number. Now, if that's true for all the districts, that served as the basis for the gross dollar amount that we set aside. If we find out we're way short or substantially less, then I think we can adjust for that. So I'm confident that in the end, we will satisfy your concerns, but obviously we appreciate your raising the concern, and that's why I supported, at least as one member, and I think the other committee members set aside that contingency fund, which should be sufficient to make up any shortfall. And so if we didn't do it on per capita, but we put a pool together, if the pool of all the districts requests a certain amount of money, then and the requests are more than what we have the ability to allocate to that more money.
Yeah, just one sidebar to that whole thing I would note is Mr. Shepro and myself are probably two who have been before you, who are, I guess I'll say, representing fire districts that straddle the county line. And so I know Mr. Shepro's district goes over into DuPage County, as does Batavia's fire district. So I know there's another line that has to be drawn, because we shouldn't be giving money away to another county. So
right. All right. Well, we're committed to make sure this turns out right. So I appreciate your
I
concern.
just wanted to put
Keep
it in
on
the record that it was raised.
Okay. And send me a copy of your book when you're finished. The CAC committee. Thank you.
Member of the audience.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. Mike Terrell, Village President, Campton Hills. I've attended some of the meetings, listened to almost every one of them through your audio recording, and very, very clear to me, this is probably one of the toughest decisions that this board has had to make. I've watched it move from one area to another and the reshuffling, and I applaud each and every one of you for your dedication to making this work. I'd like to point to probably one of the most salient statements that I heard from that's now recorded, and it's in the August 3rd meeting. And we all look at government, whether it's municipal government, Kane County government, fire districts, et cetera. But every once in a while, this panel will touch on what I think is another relevant piece of the equation, and that's the businesses. There's the $8 million that's been allocated under your program. And I would guess from listening to the discussion roundtable, it's probably the most difficult at this point in time to peg down on what the magnitude of that might be. That $8 million may or may not be sufficient. If I can, with deference to Mr. Hansen, I made comment that is probably the most salient statements made, and I'll read verbatim. Any business that is alive and well, whether as an employer, as a place of business that generates tax revenue, benefits Kane County. Skipping on, he concludes with a hybrid solution that I've heard along the way, that should a municipality not be able to use all of their allocation, they could straight pipe to our business grant program and make sure that it is earmarked to businesses in their municipalities or zip code. I heard Representative Drew Foz here also make comments that the number of small businesses probably exceeds 2,000, and therein lies the enormity of the program that's before you in ensuring that the businesses which are the lifeblood of not only Kane County, but our municipalities are sustained. We've all looked through the PPP program. We've seen the small business grants that have flowed from the federal government. And I can tell you that in touching more than a fair share of businesses, many of them lost out on either the PPP or the small business grants. This is that unique opportunity to ensure that the health of those businesses, those tax generators, are made healthy again. So I ask this panel to recommend that Mr. Hansen's solution, this hybrid solution, that any revenues returned from the municipalities go into the pool dedicated to either that municipality or zip code, be relooked at after the October 1st date. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Is there any other comment from the public?
10,000.
All right, hearing none, we'll get into our discussion items. First item, it's a placeholder on our agenda, is status of funds. Mr. Rickard, anything to add from our prior meetings?
Yes, our current balance is $92,989,873.76. The interest rates, I just want to advise you, are going from 25 basis points down to about 10. And I don't foresee that changing by year end. So I just want you to be aware of that. That's not only going to impact our CARES Act funds, it's also going to impact the interest revenue for the county.
Okay, the questions of the treasurer. Hearing none, status of intergovernmental agreements and indemnity agreements, Mr. McMahon.
So the indemnity agreements will be finalized once we get the applications back from the municipalities. Each of the municipalities received an award packet last week via email. that was sent out with a specific amount of their allocation per municipality, as you voted on and the county board voted on last Tuesday as well. So when we get those, and I'm kind of jumping ahead, I apologize on your agenda.
Oh, that's fine.
But those applications will be back from the municipalities, are due back on or before September 4th. We'll then finalize the intergovernmental agreement with each municipality as we get the applications returned.
All right, with respect to the application process, you indicated that you would send it out to the municipalities. Did that include fire protection districts, park districts, and the forest preserve?
No, it just went to, it did not go to the other units of local government.
All right,
It went to the municipalities, so villages, towns, cities.
all right. Can we provide direction now to send that out? Because I think we have the funds allocated. It's appropriate to make the request to the park districts, forest preserves, and townships.
You do. So we'll have to modify the application slightly. We'll do that, and I can do that independently. And we'll get that application, we'll get those applications out to the other units of local government as well.
Is that the will of the committee? All right. All right. So, and as to Mayor Schilke's point, there'll be a packet that goes to each of the fire protection districts and the EMS services, correct?
Correct. It'll be similar, but it will be different. It will be an application and a letter to apply, but it will not have a specific allocation like you did approve for each individual municipality.
Correct, because there was a pool, and
Pool
once we get
available.
the request back in, we'll compare them to the total amount allocated and then talk about what's appropriate at that point.
You'll have to prioritize and available dollars and et cetera, correct?
All right. So if we could push toward getting that out as early this week as possible, I'd appreciate that.
Will do.
All right, and then,
Question, Mr. Chairman?
yes,
Joe, who did those go out to at the municipalities?
So we sent them to every elected mayor or village president, depending on what the nomenclature is in each municipality. We also sent it to the chief administrator of every municipality if they have a designated administrator. So try to cover kind of two bases with each jurisdiction. That went out by email. They also received a letter, I believe that U.S. mail? Okay, so all electronically. And then we have a webinar scheduled for tomorrow afternoon that every municipality has been invited to participate in, to ask questions. Our consultant will kind of walk through the application process, try to address questions, and we've already received some questions in advance. We've got a chat feature set up so we can receive some questions and try to answer those during the webinar tomorrow afternoon, and then we'll wait to get their applications back after that.
I know that our method of communication is good. We have the Council of Mayors and the participants that have come to this meeting, so they help us get the word out. But if you have municipalities in your district that you're concerned about, I'd encourage you to contact them just to make sure they're aware. And the webinar, I think we all received the PowerPoint presentation for the webinar. It'll be interactive and hopefully answer most of the questions, so the application process should flow smoothly after that. Barb, you had a question?
Just quickly, so the applications going out to the townships, will they be addressed to the township supervisors? Is that how you do that?
I'm not sure who it'll go specifically, but we'll follow a similar procedure. So
Just to those
township
offices?
supervisor would generally be the chief elected office holder of the township. So yes, I would think we would send it to the
Okay.
supervisor's office.
All right, so the application response timeframe for the municipalities is September 4th. If we follow a similar period timeframe for the other governmental bodies, can we put a date shortly after that?
We will. So we've got Labor Day right around there, and I didn't want to make something due the day after Labor Day.
Right,
But we'll look at the calendar and try to get
the
that.
following Friday would be appropriate if we
yeah.
can.
Yes.
All right, any questions regarding the application process moving forward in that regard?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
this
Mr.
is
Caius.
Chris Caius. Yes, thank you. Just a question, does this, not the municipalities, but the next step for the other governmental agencies, will that include like the Fox River Library system?
Yeah, fucking.
As I stand here, Mr. Caius, I apologize, I don't remember every other unit of local government that was kind of designated by this committee as being eligible to apply. I thought it was,
Right, I can answer that, Mr.
Okay,
McMahon. We
please do.
did discuss other units of government, and the units that we had approved for that process were park districts, forest preserve district, and township forms of government. So we did not include library districts
Okay.
Our school districts.
or school districts. I mean, there's other taxing bodies as well. All right, any further questions on this issue? All right, then I believe you've covered item C, which is the application process and timeframes. The notice in D we talked about. The ultimate timing of distributions under paragraph E will depend, the process now will go that we'll receive applications. We have a deadline for those. They'll be vetted through the state's attorney's office and our consultant.
correct.
And then they will provide a report back. Go ahead, Mr. McMahon. If you-
Well, we'll provide a report back to this committee, and it's one thing if the application is some dollar amount less than the allocation, then either way, it'll come back to this committee. You'll have to approve or disapprove the award. There'll be decisions to make if applications exceed allocations, or when we're talking about other units of local government, you'll have to make a decision about how much of the application you're going to award to individual townships, park districts, forest preserves.
But as it related to the municipal allocations, we did adopt language in the original resolution that said if the application was submitted compliant with our requirements and an appropriate intergovernmental agreement was signed, that the state's attorney's office had the authority to direct the treasurer to make the disbursement. So if we have what I'll call a clean application, then there would be ability to immediately turn those around for funding.
That's right, and I didn't mean to confuse that issue. You're right. If it's a clean application, we'll vet it with our consultant, we'll vet it from legal compliance, and then provide that vet sheet information to the county payment process. It'll go to the auditor. It'll eventually make its way to Mr. Rickert's office, and then that money up to the amount, I think it's 80% of the allocation will go out right away.
And I think the same would be true to the extent a municipality submits an application for more than their allocated amount. If they had qualified expenditures up to that amount, we would be able to disperse that amount.
You're right.
Okay.
That's correct.
And so to the extent they had excess funds, then we would have a report on that and then move forward with that.
Correct.
Okay. Barb?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one more thought. Township highway districts and townships have separate budgets. So the highway district budget is separate from the township, the actual township administrative budget. So will you be sending them out to the highway departments as well? Or are you
No.
going to, no, just to the township?
Now, this board voted to limit the applications to townships, park districts, and forest preserve districts.
Okay, but the township highway district is also part of the township.
So
But it's a separate budget. They budget
Separate.
separately.
it's
Uh-huh.
also a separate taxing body, I believe, correct?
Correct,
Right,
yeah.
so if you would like another taxing body to be included in that pool of funds, that's an issue for you to raise with this CAC committee. And I'll send out applications to who this CAC committee directs me to.
Or can they be included under the township administrative requests? That's another idea.
Yeah, it's hard for me to answer that here. I view that as a separate taxing district.
Mhm.
And the direction that I've received from this committee is to limit the applications to townships, the three that I identified.
Mhm. Yeah, I'd like to see the highway districts included. I don't think that I don't think that their expenses were anything that would be totally outstanding, but
I think, Barb, if we had unlimited resources that would make sense. You know, we don't, the county road districts, that brings a whole nother, you know, the county transportation department with their projects, a whole new can of worms. I think what we were talking about was we allocated a limited sum to the other districts, thinking that that would be enough to satisfy that group that we were talking about. And now, if there's a compelling argument that there's significant expense in a road district you want to bring forward, we can consider that, but we'll know a lot more by mid-September as to where the applications are for those groups that we've already included versus the available funds.
Yeah, well, the highway districts are routinely, just as if it was a maintenance department at a township, disinfecting their trucks, making sure that they have the antibacterial wash for their hands when they come in. They keep the highway district employees separate in their trucks. I believe they got some sort of special mats in the warehouse. And so there are expenses. They're not extreme, but there are expenses there as to pertains to COVID, specifically to COVID. So it might be something to think about.
I would just say that, unless we wanted to make a provision that they could be funded somewhat under the township umbrella, generally speaking, the motor fuel tax and all the funding that those organizations get, the Township Highway Department, shouldn't have really been affected by COVID as far as their funding. So it would be really just the personal protective devices and the activities that should be fairly minimal.
All right, well, it's a point well taken. Does anyone on the committee want to address that or consider that at this point? Or are we comfortable moving forward with the entities that we've identified? All right, hearing none, I guess we'll move on. As far as, there's actually three items I'd like to cover this afternoon to move forward try to make some substantive progress. I'm going to skip ahead to item G next, which is the business grant program and the not-for-profit. Those are two items that we've allocated money for. Last week, we handed out a form which talked about certain criteria that other entities have used in establishing their business grant program. I don't know, Roger, can you pull that one up? And then also we looked at, we had examples of what counties had done, other counties had done, and we did receive input from a couple of the committee members regarding their take on the program with a focus on small business, which is somewhat of a nebulous term, but small business has been defined in many different ways by different governmental bodies throughout the state, or throughout the country, actually, for that matter. So in terms of this guideline here, and I think the appropriate thing would be to go through, we do have some, everyone received the communication from Mr. Sanchez and Mr. Hansen with their suggestions. I think we can go through this list. I'd like to come up with a grant program, at least a skeleton of a grant program that we can move forward to the board for approval so that we can get applications put together for that and so get those out so that the applicants can have their requests vetted and then funded as soon as possible. So we talked in the first category, the question is, well, I'm going to make an assumption, but I just want concurrence from the committee. Does the committee agree that this program is intended to be set up for small business as opposed to all businesses in general? All right, stop me if if everyone here is at least nodding, so the concurrence is to do that. Small business can be defined in different ways by revenue figures, by numbers of employees. Let's talk about the revenue number. I think you've all seen in the different areas the number of, or the dollar amounts for gross revenue that has been used in other areas. And I think it's been suggested in the proposals that were submitted by the committee members that a number of less than $2.5 million in annual gross revenue be a target number. Is that a number that we're comfortable with? All right, now, as we define this, is that during the last calendar year, or what time frame are we going to use for establishing that? I mean, if we get into the weeds here, we have to go through that. I would suggest at least, I mean, we could, one of the other, let me start out. Before that, there was some suggestion that the applicants had to be in business for at least a year beforehand. Is that a criteria that the committee wants to establish, or do we want to open it to any business, no matter how long they were open?
Any business.
I think any, I know one of the breweries, More Beer up at Huntley opened February. So it opened in February and got closed down in March. So they took care of their people, but they had no income. And we all want more beer, don't we?
Right, you support more beer. I'm sure that was,
I think,
I mean, you took the words out of my mouth, right?
I
So,
think,
Mr.
you know,
Frost?
there's two ways to look at it. I agree that all businesses should be open to this, and you know, you could look at just 2019 gross revenue, or you could look at the last 3 business years of 2016, wait, what, 2017, 18, 19. But I would say at least the 2019 gross revenues of 2.5 million or less.
Yeah, one of the challenges by not having a length of time criteria is we don't have a gross revenue number for them for the prior year.
John, if you will, one of the very first calls that my agency received back in January was from a wedding venue. And I may have spoken to this before, but the wedding venue called and asked if pandemic was covered under their insurance. And I got to be candid with you, I kind of giggled. That's in other countries, that's not here. I don't even know where you're going with this. Who knew that he was looking in a crystal ball that just 60 days later, we would be shutting down the country? And specific to him, he has 6,000 square feet under roof for these venues right now, and had just opened an additional 2,000 square feet under a separate LLC. So I look at this and say, is it a brand new entity? Sure it is, but it's just an additional location to his existing entity. And it was just poor timing that this pandemic hit at that moment. So I'm not in favor of looking at that backwards and saying he didn't qualify, you know, for the second entity. You know, he, in good faith and good conscience, you know, opened a business in addition to his primary location. And so.
All right, I think the challenge you have is if you want to have an income limitation, it's hard to, having that without an income history is difficult to enforce. So we're either going to, from a practical standpoint, open it up to all businesses, or not have an income criteria, and not have one, or have an income criteria, but they'd have to be in business as of January 1 of 2019 if we're going to use that year for a basis for income. Mr. Sanchez?
Going off that idea, I think it's good if they were open last year to use that number. If they were new this year, something I was thinking, maybe we only cover rent. If they pay rent for their brick and mortar location, maybe that's all we cover, because they can't show what their revenue would have been. I think we can kind of estimate at least a ballpark that, you know, if I know a guy that opened a barber shop, for instance, that's not going to break the $2 million revenue threshold, but he was opening up right as it hit. And so, you know, trying to make some concessions for new businesses, I think there's got to be a way we can determine who would qualify if they were open year round, who would qualify under that 2.5 million.
Jared, this wedding venue is right in your district, so.
I think I know what you're talking about.
All right, well, what's the will of the committee? Do we want to have a income criteria or not?
I think we really need to.
Yeah, I think we need it.
I'm sorry, if a guy just opened up, or a couple just opened up a business, they're going to be less than 2.5 million. I mean, I don't know anybody that starts up, you know, out the gate with that kind of gross sales. So I think they would still meet the criteria.
If Benny's moved into Geneva and started a new entity to do that, they would have more than $2.5 million, but just be a startup as of February or
I guess
March.
we'd have to mention multiple locations or branches.
See, I mean, the challenge is we have to get a clean application in that's easily vetted through the process. And, you know, one way, of course, would be to include a copy of the federal tax return for 2019 to show revenue, and have that criteria there to keep it within the small arena. Mr. Martin.
I'm not on the committee, but I wanted to just offer an opinion. I think it's important to remember that we need to paint with a very broad brush here, which means that some people and some businesses are not going to get what we want them to get. But in order to have a project that we can administer, we can't, you know, if you're going to paint a barn, you've got to use a big brush, not an artist brush. And I think we've got a barn to paint here, and I just would want us to move ahead, recognizing that there are going to be some people that are not going to fare well in what we do, because by default, it's just going to be the case. But we need to benefit the whole by putting a distribution method together, which is predictable and on the whole.
You know, that does raise another question, and I probably should have started with this first, but one of the questions is what's the appropriate grant amount? And I know we've had discussions, I think Lake County had a $30,000 maximum grant amount. We had talked about it, making this available to as many businesses as possible, and as a result, the suggested maximum grant was $15,000, at least from the committee members that I heard from. So if 15,000 gets a certain number of grants out there potentially, if there's more applicants than grants and we broaden the scope of businesses that qualify, then we will have an issue to deal with. But I'm gonna, let's go back and talk about the amount. Is 15,000 the number that we want to use as a as the maximum limit, knowing that if we have extra funds that aren't allocated, we can supplement that, as been suggested by Mr. Terrell? Yes?
The $15,000 number is the number I suggested, but that's also based on what sort of expenses are they going to be applying for reimbursement for. That almost becomes the first question, then you figure out the amount. I don't feel this should be a business rescue or making up for lost revenues or missed revenues. If it's a very small universe of rent, overhead, meaning utilities, we have buildings that can very well be shared with residential properties above or within the same building. I want to make sure the utilities are going towards the business utilities. Any sort of workplace enhancements or safety protocols that were taken, or expenses regarding being able to reopen, as well as being able to safely operate for their customers or with the public. But once you define the possible expenses, then maybe the grant amount will kind of.
I know this is like trying to herd cats. Let's talk about a dollar amount. I think let's focus on the dollar amount. Is $15,000 what the committee want to consider, or do we want to consider something greater than that amount?
Sturgis would go 20.
20?
I don't think it's enough.
Okay.
You know, you might be wasting 15,000. It might need 30 to survive. You got a boat sinking.
All right, so we have a couple 20s. Mr. 20. Yeah, my inclination was to go greater than 15, knowing that would make it more limited, but it actually, for those who would receive it, would have a bigger impact. Ms. Thomas, do you have a concern or a suggestion?
I'm okay with 20.
20. All right, so can we say as a committee, the consensus is a $20,000 limit?
Yes.
All right, now let's get back to the issue of number of employees. How about if we see if we can accomplish that? It was suggested that in other jurisdictions, they've used a limited number with less than 50 employees. That seemed to be a small business limit. I just want to The only comment I have is if we're going to put a per employee limit on it, is that we use full-time equivalents for employees, because you may have a business that has a number of part-time people that, is small but may have 70 employees that, has really 20 full-time equivalents and would fit within that criteria. So I think that's just a twist to that we should consider. The suggested number that we had received was 50 or fewer full-time equivalent employees. Is that a number that we're comfortable with?
Comfortable?
Yes.
So,
All right, now, given the fact that now we've got this grant criteria for smaller businesses, okay, now let's get back to the revenue issue. Are we going to have a revenue requirement or not? Mr. Fraz?
I think we should have a revenue requirement because, as you know, a lot of the federal money was just sucked up by the big businesses. As far as the business that has not been in business for a year, so they can't show their 2019 revenues, I would say in that case, could we just limit them to up to a $5,000 grant if they can't show a previous year's revenue, or limit them to 5 or 10,000 or something, just to make it simple?
I think that's a two-tiered approach. So the suggestion is that to qualify for the full 20,000, you'd have to be in business since January 1 of 2019, and also have gross revenue for 2019 as reflected in your federal tax return of 2.5 million or less. Are we comfortable with that?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
So Jared, if you and I can have a conversation, just because my memory's not as sharp as it once was. So we had this glorious Italian restaurant on the corner in our district, Francesca's. Francesca's moved out, that building sat vacant. Somebody finally spent their life savings to get this place open. I don't think that they were open a week before COVID shut them down.
Right.
These people are out everything. I will eat their pizza anytime they want to open up. And they are open now, but they are limping. I mean, limping along. I look at them and say, they don't have any revenues from 2019. They literally.
So Mr. Fraz's suggestion is they could apply under this second tier program.
But be limited to $5,000?
I think
No.
10,000 would be a
That's-
reasonable number.
5's not enough.
5's not enough. Exactly.
Would $10,000 be reasonable under that circumstance?
Mr. Sanchez, this is our area. I'm going to bat
All
for our
right, can you
peeps.
please direct your communication?
I'm so sorry.
Mr.
I'm
Chairman?
sorry.
I'm not a egomaniac. I just want to keep things flowing properly. Mr. Sanchez?
I'm comfortable with that
Is that 10?
Is that 10?
at 10.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, because some businesses won't even need that much if, they're just going to cover rent and some little overhead PPE and stuff like that. That 10,000 sounds good to me.
All right, so what we're talking about is a $2.5 million revenue in business as of 1/1/2019. And that would be eligible for a $20,000 grant. Any other business that is in business would have the ability to apply with a maximum of $10,000. Does that seem reasonable as a group moving forward? And Mr. McMahon or Mr. Lovelace, please stop us if you have questions on any of these. We'll try to fill in a skeleton here of a framework for a proposal, then we can go forward.
Oh, I appreciate that. There's 3 of us here trying to kind
Okay.
of keep track of the discussion.
Sure. I'm sorry, I didn't see.
It's okay. No, things are going fast and furious. I get it. We're keeping up, I think. But what I'm hearing is to qualify for the 20,000, at least that's what the discussion is now. To qualify for the 20,000 in business since January 1, 2019. Is there also the gross revenue of 2.5 million limit there?
Yes.
Okay. Otherwise, the limit for application is up to 10,000.
Right. And to be qualified for an applicant, you have to have a business venue here in Kane County. Is that how we decide what a Kane County business is?
Yeah.
Our office or storefront or store or restaurant is located within Kane County, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, you might have some companies that not everybody has a brick and mortar storefront, so I'd say your
Principal place of
Your
business. would
principal
then be-
place of business, your address has to
Right.
be in Kane County.
All right.
Your incorporation papers.
And then a 50 or fewer full-time equivalents as well.
Right. Okay, so we, now let's talk to Mr. Hansen's point about what expenses are eligible. I don't know, Ms. Thomas?
Can we require the 990 for those businesses that qualify for the 20,000?
990, that's a
I mean, the tax
IRS
return.
form?
The tax return, yes.
Yes, yes, we would, that will be part of the application, is that tax return would be the criteria for reflecting the gross revenue.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
All right, Mr. Sanchez.
I just have a concern. If we're going to only allow for the $20,000 tier businesses that started by January 2019, there's a lot of businesses that would have started later in 2019 that would be able to qualify. Now they wouldn't be able to. Is that what I'm understanding?
Right, because we've got that year's income criteria, and I don't think this is different than what the other areas have done. If we're going to have a,
Okay, so then they would still be able to apply for the 10,000?
correct.
Okay.
All right, now on to eligible expenses. I know we had suggested rent / mortgage payments, utilities, payroll, PPE, that type of thing. The goal, again, the criteria can't be for lost revenue. We're going to follow the federal model on that. So in terms of suggested requirements, does anyone object to those eligible expenses, which are really spelled out in the federal guidelines for reimbursable expenses, the rent, the payroll? I know a lot of restaurants, for example, kept employees on or paid them for a period of time. They had to pay rent when they were closed for business. They may have rent in abeyance right now on some of them, but if those are the criteria, are we okay with that, Ms. Thomas?
Are we excluding companies that have received the Paycheck Protection Funds or EIDL funds?
I think that's a different discussion, but I think what we would do is have them have to certify that they didn't already receive compensation for this. So you maybe have a PPP applicant who applied for that first PPP section. Again, we're talking about expenses for the full year, maybe March to the end of the year. PPP covered, I think it was 8 weeks worth of compensation. So someone may have received a PPP loan and used that for that period of time, but now has expenses for the rest of the year that would be covered. So they would have to submit in their application an affidavit that says that those funds haven't been reimbursed from other grant sources. I think that would be the consideration. Yes, Mr. Hanson, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, and that is a different conversation too that we have to have, and that's the possible duplication of aid that was received. And besides the PPP, you've had at least 3 different Illinois programs that some of that money has made their way to King County. A lot of us have restaurants and those types of establishments in mind right now as we have the conversation. But the $14 million hospitality emergency grant program was $14 million that came out to any applicant within the state, and 29 recipients were located in Kane County that only accounted for $560,000. But if one of those places happened to have received $10,000 and they had $17,000 worth of qualifying expenses, I have no problems with that entity applying for the remaining $7,000 that were not covered by a state program or a federal program. So I don't want to exclude anyone that received funding, provided they still have a balance that has not been approved yet. But there are several programs to keep an eye on for possible duplication of aid.
Mr. Sanchez?
I just have some concern with allowing for payroll, only because that could really soak up a lot of the money very quickly and reduce the amount of applicants that could get approved. I don't know if that's true, because I know a lot of people laid off their employees. So it's just something I wanted to put into the air. Do we want to allow payroll, all payroll, yes or no?
Well, that's interesting. If you look at the PPP loan process, that was heavily weighted toward payroll. And so the other expenses that were subject to being reimbursed or forgiven, utility costs, rent, and that, those were, I don't want to say shorted, but the theory being it was, PPP was payroll protection, it was to keep people employed. And so I would guess that the bulk of the money that was received was used toward payroll expenses, because that's what you have to do to make the loan forgivable. Mr. Surgis, you had a comment.
I certainly don't know or have memorized or claim to the federal guidelines on this, but part of the grant process that I would like to see is the small business owners that I know needed to go portable. I mean, Roger will attest. It's one day we were in the office with a desktop and a monitor. The next day, I needed a VoIP phone, I needed laptops, I needed dual monitors for my people, I needed cameras, I needed microphones, I needed all this stuff that magically was supposed to appear out of the air, and it became a war of who could get the CDW the fastest to place your order. Even if it was close enough, at least I had it to stay in business. And I don't know a small business owner that has an office who didn't deploy from home and have at least $10,000 or $15,000 in hardware, software, just keep me up and running. So while I understand there's programs out there, and I agree with some of my colleagues that the PPP was geared toward hard costs. Your employees, it was rent, it was utilities, but there's all this other stuff that we're still utilizing today to keep people out of the office place. And I would like that to be considered. You know, hey, I had $10,000 in additional computer expenses just to move people off site. I would ask that that be something that we would consider.
Mr. Kenyon?
There'd be no payroll if the business was closed. The PPP was to encourage people to stay open. So you had to pay the money out. So the business, if you're closed, there's no money paid out. But we have, like his expenses, let's say you buy a cooler, you have a flower shop. You have to buy a cooler to have your flowers in. It's useless. You know, once you buy something, it's useless anymore. You never get your money back. Like the car, you drive out of the dealership, you lose all that. So a barber shop, they have stuff because they have to sterilize that, and the beauty shops, they have a lot of additional expenses that.
Well, a lot of them were closed completely.
Yeah,
So
but the expense was there.
I guess, what I'm hearing is that the consensus is that eligible expenses would include rent, utilities, workplace modifications, remote working expenses. Those are kind of a PPE equipment and the cleaning supplies, that kind of thing. The issue is, do we want to expand it to payroll as well? If we limited it to those first items, that first group of items, then that would provide more resources to more potential applicants if we felt comfortable with that. But if we want to include payroll, we've got a maximum of $20,000. I know there's a number of businesses that will max out pretty easily. Mr. Frost?
I'm real comfortable. That's the exact list I had with adding Cliff's remote operating expenses. So those four for sure, I would say, the rent, mortgage, PPE, and modifications to the business, utilities, remote operation expenses. And the only one I would throw out there, and I'm not a proponent for it necessarily, I just want to throw it out there for discussion. For example, the business I was in was very heavy on equipment payments. So if you have a monthly loans like a farmer has for equipment, or your restaurant might have an equipment loan, could they put in X amount for monthly payments on facility or equipment?
So if we included under leasing, that would include facility or
rent,
equipment
mortgage, or equipment
leasing.
payment, equipment payment or leasing.
Right. The mortgage payment concept, if you really dissect that, that includes payment of principal. Really, it should be mortgage interest if we're talking about it. Someone could pay off their mortgage, and then if they made a $20,000 mortgage payment, then they would get the benefit of what we're talking about is more operating expense type numbers than, all right. So if we have a lease, let me just go through the lease. You've got under rental expenses for facilities or equipment, PPP equipment, cleaning supplies, utilities, workplace modification, remote working expenses and equipment. And then mortgage interest.
Absolutely.
All right. All right, that's a comprehensive list that leaves out payroll. Is that the will of the committee to do that, or does the committee want to include payroll?
I like the list.
I like those, and I don't know how to say, but you can't double dip on payroll, so I'm at a loss.
Mr. Hanson?
I'd never taken the equipment lease into consideration. There needs to be some fine print in there about when that equipment was acquired. That can't have been someone's shopping trip when this took place. It should have been existing equipment that was already essential to the business.
I think under the PPP program or PPE program, there was, no, payroll protection, PPP program, there was a requirement for rental expenses for leases in force as of January 1 of 2020. So we could put that criteria in for any of the leases that we had to address that specific concern. All right, so I want to take first of all, with respect to the list I just went through, consensus of the committee that we're okay with that list? All right, what about the consensus of the committee regarding including payroll expense? Are we for or against that? Mr. Franz is a no?
No.
No.
It's a slippery slope.
I think that needs to be in there.
All right, so that would be, okay, so that's understood. And Mr. McMahon, I think I have a pretty good handle on what the criteria is. The game plan is to put in motion a formal resolution that will document the program as we've indicated, and, subject to final approval by the board as a whole. And we can even work on applications maybe in the interim on the assumption that we'll get this passed, but we'll have to talk this through. Ultimately, the board has to approve this. Let me see, what else has to become first come first? I mean, how about, how do we process the applications? That's a question. And what is the time frame? Do we do a 2-week process? A 1-week process? Is the marketing arm for this will be our chambers of commerce, the cities will let their businesses know. The villages that have businesses, we'll let them know. Obviously, we'll have information at our website that will be user-friendly. But do we want to put a 2-week window on the application process?
Yes, something.
Yes.
There has to be a cutoff.
All right. And then how do we deal with this? Do we see what comes in, or are we going to process this? If there's a 2-week process to file for the grants, are we going to favor the ones that come in first? Or are we going to take the whole pool and then evaluate them and make a
You
decision?
have to go from the pool.
I'm so sorry. Are we in any way on this limiting bookmarking funds for geo areas similar to the way we did using the map for the other funds? So East Dundee, you get your funds, Carpentersville, you get yours, Aurora, North Aurora, this is the amount available for your grant? Or is this all in a big bucket in the first out? Am I describing that okay?
I think the plan as originally constituted was $8 million for the county as a whole without a geographic allocation. We could modify it to say that the funds are allocated based on geographic area, although you get into the arguments, like, for example, the unincorporated areas don't have a lot of businesses that are in them just by definition.
That money can go right back into the,
And
to a
then
kitty then.
you have the business that is in the village of Campton Hills that serves all the unincorporated areas, and that would argue that they go further. We didn't discuss that. I was under the assumption that the plan moving forward was countywide, just as the other counties have been.
I'm under the same assumption.
Okay.
That's actually pretty fair. We don't favor one town or because of their size.
But if we're going to do this as a county as a whole, we have to have a criteria if we have more applications than money available, how we're going to allocate the funds. Other programs have been first come, first serve. You know, obviously we can tailor this however we want. It's just a plan, the administration of the plan creates pressure in terms of how we vet the applications. Now, again, we do have a contingency fund that could supplement this if we get more requests than available funds, but we also need to have extra money to cover fire districts in other areas too.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Doug Sheffel. Yeah, I would just, if I could weigh in, that some sort of attempt to geographical balance, not, not a mathematical amount, but it seems like that ought to be one of the goals or part of a priority. I don't know if you've discussed that, but this document says minority, women, et cetera. Some geographical balance would, I would argue for it being included. And along those, and then my only other comment while I'm talking is the 2 weeks is, to me, a very quick turnaround. I think, I just think there's a lot of businesses that aren't going to get that memo and get it submitted that quick. I would go longer, but that's it.
Well, the 2-week time period is suggested. We could make it 30 days if you want, but we have to get the funds administered and out as quickly as possible. And I think the pressure is that the businesses need the money now. And so that's why I've always been pushing these tighter timeframes as we go through this deliberate process of setting the rules. So if we don't, if we get the word out, the word is out that we have a grant program. Now we're going to get the word out about the details that we formulated, but we have to get this program formally approved by the board. So as a practical matter, if this isn't going to happen to our September board meeting, we need to have the applications in by the end of September to get the money out. So I would say leading up to it, Doug, if we can market this as best we can so we can get the program approved, or maybe even call a special board meeting to get this approved if we need to, we may want to consider that.
So if I could, so it might make a difference as to whether, on day 15, are they ineligible and out of the money, or on day 15 through day 30, they can still apply, and if it's available, but, in other words, would it be a drop dead date, or is that just when the initial grants start going out? There could be some flexibility in there.
All right, Mr. Martin.
I would endorse the short date, the 2-week date. The other issue is that we'll have a series of decisions to make after that time is done. And we're going to run out of time if we.
Plus, it's going to take time for our staff and consultant to vet the application.
Well, that's right. So time is not our benefactor here. I think we need to, part of that broad brush that I harped about was to keep it short.
I just, quick. I know we have a countywide program, but if we're going to keep it open for 2 weeks and don't go on a first come, first served basis, which seems to be the will of the committee, then are we going to get into discussion about regional allocation of funds, as Mr. Shefflow mentioned, so that, let's say, Elgin has all the applications the majority of the applications. And do we then limit that because they only have a certain percentage of the population? We do have a framework within which we could do allocations, just because we had to do that for the municipal applications if we wanted to.
Let's make it simple. Make it countywide. Don't put barriers up to make our job or their jobs harder.
All
We
right.
get a 2-week time frame. People have to review all that stuff, and it'll take another week or two to pass it out.
All right, then we would need to be in a position, once those applications come in, if we have more requests than available funds, how we're going to trim we either supplement with additional money, or we decide to adjust the grants based on the applicants. Mr. Sanchez?
I'm in favor of keeping it simple and making it first come, first serve, but let's have a short list of prioritization so that some businesses will go to the top of that list, so they get taken care of first. I know Matt's idea was businesses closed through phase 2, and I was suggesting maybe businesses closed through phase 3 would go to the top of the line. So like hair salons and things like that.
What businesses were required to be closed in phase 3?
I believe weren't hair salons still closed in phase 3 and things like that?
I think so.
Okay, well, the ones that were impacted the most, things like something like that, some sort of list of businesses that would be considered first.
I think the fact that we've eliminated the payroll from the requirement is going to maybe, limit expenses, I think, that we're going to have in terms of applications, such that we don't need to do a prioritization. I mean, that's another vetting requirement, and I don't know if we get into a can of worms. Mr. McMahon, do you want to address that?
Well, I have some concerns about my ability to vet kind of the applications. We may get in hundreds of applications within a 2-week time period. I've got to turn around those I've got to vet those from program compliance, legal compliance, and as we add components to this,
right,
it makes it really difficult for my staff to really process that and get them back to you. So, this is an important issue. I'm not trying to minimize it, but I have to have a program that I can review and administer and get back to you with, okay, these expenses are covered and the business fell within your parameters.
I also want to keep in the historic context, as we started this, seems like months ago, but it's just weeks ago. We were talking about having the business grants flow through the cities. And if we did that, the cities, they would have been allocated based on city allocation. So if we get into criteria about prioritizing businesses based on certain criteria, we get into I think in the weeds that may make it much more complex than we're going to be able to accommodate. I think if we have a general program that takes in applications and we see what the total requests are versus available funds, given the limitations we've put in terms of the eligible expenses, we'll be in a decent position to sort through that at that point.
John, is my math correct, Joe? So if we had 8 million divided by 20,000, that's a maximum of 400 grants?
That's for existing businesses before then, and if you've got
right,
newer businesses, you got at 10,000. Ms. Thomas?
My concern about the first come, first serve is the very small business that's, 2 or 3 people. They may not have the bandwidth to turn around the application in 2 or 3 days. And so that's one concern I have. And I agree with Mr. Hanson, and I think Mr. Sanchez agreed that we should definitely make sure we have funds available for minority and veteran-owned businesses.
That's another layer of criteria that we, again, I think if we're going to do an allocation, I'd be more in favor of pushing it based on a population than through the cities and deal with it that way. And then every city would get an allocation because every city has their own needs. I'm not saying we'd give the money to the city. We do allocations to those addresses by that. But I mean, my sense is, and just given the time frame we've got, if we move forward without any prioritization at this point, Then when we get the applications in, we can make a decision. And really, what I would see the outcome of that would be if we have 20% more requested than is available, we can either reduce the grant total by 20% or supplement it by adding additional funds from contingency. I think that's a practical way of resolving it. And we'll be at a point then where we know where the city requests are and whether there's additional funds available. Mr. Frost?
Chairman,
Mr. Frost?
Yeah, I just making some notes here. I agree with Mr. Shefflo somewhat. I still think that 2-week time period is somewhat short, and 30 days seems somewhat long. There's no reason we can't do a 3-week period. I don't really agree with any kind of geographical distribution. I don't care if a place is in Algonquin or Montgomery. It's a Kane County business and needs help. As far as the first come, first serve, I'm just, I could see that being used only if the requests exceed the amount of money we have to work with. Then we could just start with the first ones received and work through them. And I'm all for a very simple application, 1 page if we can do it, and keep it simple. And boy, that's another big can of worms if you start looking at, are you a veteran-owned business, or, everybody knows that everybody made their wife the CEO of the company when, and so there's just another big can of worms, I think, that's going to complicate things. So I say keep it simple, get the money out to the small businesses as fast as possible.
Mr. Hanson?
Thank you. I worked through several counties' open portal application process, and that's going to be real work to do it, but there are some very simple programs that are out there that do have some flags in there that I don't think would preclude or prioritize necessarily whether or not a business receives funding. But I suggested some things in the document that came out that I think I'll continue to stand by, that there are 6 zip codes in particular in our county that have been identified as those that get hit the most. They got hit the hardest with this actual pandemic. It can be a flag. If you're a minority business owner or a veteran-owned business, that can be a flag. And just simply ticking yes or no. And should we get to a point where we have if we've had more requests than we have funds available, that can make it a priority. The other part too that's not been mentioned yet today is, are we for sure going to be helping businesses that have shown and demonstrated a hardship? One of the reasons I believe we're talking about businesses that have been in business since 2019 is they can show a demonstrated revenue loss, that they actually are hurt by this. So far, no one has said that that's going to be a criterion.
I can, those are all valid points, but I think the reason we received unanimous support, I believe, for our vote on creating this program was that we weren't going to focus this on 3 or 4 zip codes or 5 zip codes. And in fact, if we wanted to get into a macroeconomic analysis, we would argue that a larger percentage of the tax revenue that supports certain functions at the county comes from those areas, not those areas, but the other areas where the larger businesses are located, or there's more thriving small businesses. So if your goal was to try to generate as much tax revenue, you'd pour the money in there. I don't think we have time for that debate, is what I'm saying. And I think the fair thing to do is to have it as a countywide program. Otherwise, we're going to go back and forth.
I agree. I'm from day one, it should be countywide.
Right.
But to the last part of my comment, we haven't established that this is going to businesses that have been hurt. As of right now, it's anyone can apply.
Well, we talked about eligible expenses that would be covered.
Right, but is that for a business that was closed or sustained a revenue loss over a period of time before that? Right now, it's for anyone that could have, especially cleaning business, that's having the best year of their existence can apply for money.
All right, well, can we get off is it the committee have a consensus about whether we want to leave this open broadly to countywide, or are we going to and eliminate the focus on special criteria for special types of businesses, and then we'll evaluate once the applications come in? Are we comfortable with doing that?
Countywide, but I at least want to track whether it's a minority or veteran-owned business, even if we're not using that as.
How do we define the term minority?
Well,
I
I'm
mean,
sure we
that's-
can,
that creates we can debate that for days.
we could use SBA guidelines, I suppose.
60-year-old white male.
No, I think we
minority.
could use
I'm just
SBA guidelines.
I'm just, a little levity. I know in this political correct world, we can't
not
do
ready
that,
for
but,
that. No levity.
all right. But, you know, there's different definitions of what, you know, is minority of female. I don't know if that's necessarily a minority criteria. So I think if we go with a general broad-based application, see what comes in, then we can evaluate where we're at that point. All right, and I'm committed to make sure is one vote on this committee and one vote on the board to, you know, this is a priority for our allocations of funds. If we are short here, you know, I'll be an advocate to supplement this to make sure we get the resources to take care of it. Mr. Surges?
I just want to go on record. We allocated based on geographic and numbers per town. I'm advocating personally, and it doesn't sound like it's popular, but I would advocate that there's a certain amount going to each zip code area that they can count on. If they don't use it, it goes back. That would just be me.
Right.
4 zip codes.
What's that?
Elgin's got 4 zip codes.
Do we, okay, so the last, I think the one final point that's missing out of this, and I think we have a decent framework for a program that we can work on fine tuning, would be this concept of having to prove loss that Mr. Hansen raised, that if you have a business that's been breaking records and busier than they had been before, that they're not necessarily in a hardship situation. So, you know, the question is, again, knowing the limitations we have, how do we establish that if we can't use lost revenue as a criteria? Because that's,
You can use it as a criterion. They're not going to be applying for the revenues they lost. If you need a measuring stick from, say, March 1st or I'm sorry, January 1st through whatever, May the 1st of 2019, and your business it generated $700,000 in gross revenues over that period of time, and you can talk to your accountant and bring your statement saying that you only generated $510,000 during this year, you're hurting.
does the state's attorney have a comment on that? Whether that would be permissible?
It would be, I'm struggling with how I'm going to document that and the varying levels of sophistication that businesses are run. We have a very small business that has 1 or 2 employees that may generate a lot of revenue. I don't know how I'm going to document that. And
You know, I guess to your point, what we could do is you could say if you were closed and, you know, from operating in any period of time, that would be a criteria for applying. But that would limit it to, that knocks off a bunch of businesses that were able to operate in a much more limited scope. So by doing that, you're cutting out a bunch of entities as well. Mr. Surges?
Joe, just to make your job a little harder, the professional clients that I have didn't lose 1 dime of revenue, but it cost us considerably more just to claw back to where we were. Those laptop computers didn't fall out of the sky, and we all spent $30,000 on additional product to be able to deploy from home just to make it back to the levels that we were at. So honestly, we didn't lose anything. It just cost us so much more to get back there. So we didn't close our doors.
What Mr. Hansen's suggesting is you shouldn't qualify.
Right.
That's right, and I disagree wholeheartedly. That's
the
ridiculous.
debate that we
Federal
have to have.
aid for businesses that are struggling the most.
But, I mean, do we want to, we have to have criteria that the state's attorney and our grant coordinator is going to be able to review and be able to make a fairly straightforward decision. Mr.
Chairman.
Yes.
Sheffield. Yeah, on that issue, that seems like on programs I've seen, couldn't be specific, that, the applicant has to state that they suffered a hardship or have experienced hardship and either describe it narratively. It may not be, I wouldn't believe the state's attorney's office would get out there and calculate that hardship, but at least make applicant state it. And then while I'm talking, this other issue is, and you mentioned it, to some extent, aren't we hiring an experienced professional organization? Are we doing this kind of prematurely if we're bringing in a full-time employee and I don't know what the organization is, that wouldn't this be a lot easier if they were up and running and say, okay, here's our experience based on these kind of programs?
I think again, that's all great ideas, but we have a limited time frame, and I think these are going to work hand in hand as we craft an outline of what a program will be. Then the state's attorney with the consultant's input will help us draft a resolution consistent with what we've outlined. Mr. Fraz?
I don't know, maybe I'm too trusting of human nature, but this is going to be a distressed business, applications for distressed businesses. Could we trust the people to apply that they are in fact distressed, and then trust our reviewers to red flag something if it's got a funny sound to it? But I don't know.
I think in the PPP application, you had to make a statement to that effect. In this application, you'd also have to make a statement that indicates the expenses you're seeking reimbursement for have not been provided for in any other grant program. I know those would be statements under oath. I also know in reading that there's been now some investigation about PPP fraud, and they're looking at that. But I think what the federal government did is take people's word for it, with the ability to go back and check after the fact because of the urgency of the need.
I think we got to keep this thing simple and just
Excuse me, Chairman Hoshai.
Yes.
This is Commissioner Barrero. I agree with everything that you guys have been saying, but I think you're actually just kind of spinning your wheels, because there's criteria that you could just, which I'm sure staff will be able to do as State's Attorney's Office, mirror to other counties that are already distributing funds. I'm sure there's some type of program or paperwork that we could just mirror and not go into the weeds on. You understand what I'm saying? Because I know you all want to get this money out in a timely fashion, because we're so many months behind already, that I think if the Scott Berger and the State's Attorney's Office mirrored other counties like DuPage County and Will County, possibly we could get this going a little faster.
Right.
Just go off of their criteria as far as how they're handling this.
Could we move forward and, make that one of our points of research or clarification in the meantime?
I think maybe the suggestion would be, with the outline that we've prepared today, that we give the state's attorney direction to put together what that program would look like, and then bring it back to us next week for a final approval. And if there's suggestions for clarification or areas that that'll be trouble spots, that those could be pointed out to us. Is that fair? Ms. Thomas, you are next.
So just to be clear, because I'm not sure. I think that businesses that were closed through phase 3 should be given priority. And so if we don't get, if we only get like 200 applications and that does not exhaust funds, then we can consider those businesses, that haven't experienced as much hardship. But if you were closed through phase 3 of the reopening. I mean, I just think that's a simple guideline to follow. I mean, we've got those businesses defined through the
Well,
states.
I don't think we're hurt by asking that question on the application. And then we could see what what applications come in. At least we'll have that data as we evaluate the applications.
I think we should look at those businesses first.
Obviously, we want to get the money to the, who needs it the most. So if we could do that simply, I would support it.
All right, now, do they have to be partially closed or completely closed?
Oh, man. I think what, like Mr. Surges says, it costs you more money to run your business, and that's what a lot of this is. But if you lose money, so we have two groups of people, lost revenue and additional expenses.
Right.
To make it as complicated as we want, but that's the way it is.
All right, why don't we do this? Mr. McMahon, do you have enough information to outline a program for us?
I do. I can put together a draft of a resolution that'll at least kind of, I think, move this forward based on what I've heard today.
And then if we want to put any other restrictions, those can simply be added, and we can talk about that throughout the week and then come back.
Would we come back this week or next week for a meeting?
I don't know, we'll figure that out at the end of the meeting.
Oh, what's his turnaround time or recommendation?
They'll have it to us within a week.
I'd like a week, yes.
Yes, all right. All right, very good. So we'll move on from that. As you can see, this is not as simple a process as you would like. Okay, I did also want to talk about the not-for-profit pool of funds that we have created. We need to establish a program for applications for that. That needs to be obviously publicized and an application prepared. One of the questions is are we going to put criteria? Are we going to limit the amount of the grant? And then are we going to create a structure for the types of nonprofit entities that we would consider eligible for these resources? So open up for discussion. Let's talk about do we want to have it open to all nonprofits, or do we want to limit the types of nonprofits that we were going to fund? Mr. Frost.
I think we do have to limit it. And, there's a lot of things that fall under not-for-profit. I belong to a little civic association in LaFox, and it's a not-for-profit, and we don't need any funds. But I would certainly like to give the absolute top priority to our well-known organizations, our doing humanitarian services, the homeless shelters, the food banks, things like that are directly, that money's going in and out and right to the people.
Ms. Thomas?
I concur with Mr. Frost. So basic needs, shelter, food, maybe nonprofits that assist with employment.
Now, all right, let me ask other
How do we
committee
include
members.
mental health, like in Elgin at the Eckert Center? Obviously, they were really stressed in these times.
So we're talking homeless shelters, we're talking food banks and mental health facilities or centers.
Comfortable with that.
Services, mental health services.
This is facilities or services. What does the rest of the committee think about limiting the request to those entities?
Personally, I think there's chambers of commerce that are essential to be receiving. I mean, all of this effort that we're doing toward the business grants, the chambers of commerce are really the center point that helps spearhead that. And we want to make sure that they're healthy enough to get this information out where we need them.
All right, so Mr. Sanchez.
I would, if there's any organizations that work for children, like disadvantaged children, orphans. I know we have Casa Kane County. I don't know that they would need to apply. They have other funding. But if there's anything like that. I don't know about Chamber of Commerce just because that isn't directly helping people in dire need. And I think what we're leaning towards is helping people or organizations that help people in dire need.
Right. You know, the one thing that, and I get back to my comments before, I think that, you know, the one thing I learned when I was elected is how diverse the county is, and the concerns in my district are different than concerns in your district, and then the concerns in Cliff's district. So, you know, whereas in Cliff's district, you know, the homeless situation isn't as dire, but the business situation could be dire. And so the focus on helping those entities could be a priority. Whereas in my district, you know, I don't have, Lazarus House is adjacent to my district, and we have a big homeless need and expenses in St. Charles that need to get taken care of. So I think we need to be open to all those and just understand that the concerns are different. The issue is we've got a limited amount of money, and how do we best allocate it in this situation? This is a very similar discussion that we have as we do our riverboat allocations every year with our external programs. And I think we've funded them all in different ways over different years. But I acknowledge where Mr. Surgis is coming from on this issue as it relates to, you know, the need for other entities. I think, though, in order to, this is an area that if we keep it open broadly, we're going to have way more applications than we are for available funds. So if we set a limited criteria to start with, I think we'll be better suited to help. Mr. Frost?
I guess I would, and I do understand Cliff's point, because we're actually asking the chambers to almost be our point people in those towns. So I'm not against some kind of allotment for them helping us administrate this. But in general, as far as the broad stroke, I would say organizations that are providing direct humanitarian support to residents of Kane County.
Mr. Martin?
It would also be interesting to know as we choose those, I think some of these organizations have pretty big endowment funds. And I don't want to be unfair, but when you talk about need, you know, I want it to be people that don't have another resource.
Well, and then we could also talk about whether they serve Kane County only or they serve multiple jurisdictions, which is true for a number of the facilities. So again, I know we set aside this amount. I think if I have to, even though I probably personally would be more biased in Mr. Surgis's direction to be more inclusive, being one who was trying to get votes together to support this program in the first place, I think the emphasis for most board members was to deal with the humanitarian, you know, the homeless, the food shelters, things of that nature. So that's really where the bulk of the support came from in getting that allocation, if I had to pull the board as a whole. So you know, what we need to do is at least come up, do we want to limit the criteria? Is a consensus to do so in the manner in which Mr. Frost indicated? Let's go around the committee and take a consensus. Mr. Sanchez, I believe you said yes, right? Ms. Thomas?
Yes.
Kenyon? Hanson? Mr. Surgis?
I'm all for it with the exception of broadening for business-specific items such as the chambers of commerce. I hear from each of you, every conversation, that the advocacy and the small businesses, well, these chambers are not affected right now. I've been as honest as I can, but they're gonna run out of money because it didn't come in all summer. And it's gonna be January in the dead of winter when they've got nothing going. And we're saying it's at the economic slowdown that they normally receive coming out of a COVID and places are out of money. We need that advocate on the street to keep those businesses and giving them direction and doing the marketing for them on a bigger scale. That's all I'm asking for. It's just the Chamber of Commerce's, if they could just get a small portion, and then everything else can go toward humanitarian efforts.
That was included in my recommendation.
Then I love you, Drew. Perfect.
I love you too.
I would actually argue that maybe they should be considered under the business grant program if they're business oriented.
Let's not go back. 20-minute
Don't
roll.
have enough-
20-minute roll. Okay.
We're running out of money, sir.
All right.
Running out.
All right. So what is the consensus? We talked about humanitarian 501c3 organizations. Are we going to include chambers of commerce or not?
I think we should, just because it's, but I could see giving a big chunk of money to a homeless shelter and a small chunk of money to the chamber, but at some point, we need to include them. Are they all, are they traditionally not-for-profits?
Oh, yeah.
The chambers are? If they're a
Don't
true,
make any money.
Drew, I'm making that assumption. I don't know the answer to that,
Right.
actually.
yeah.
The next question is going to be, are we going to limit the amount of the grant? And so that's going to, be a tough decision here. I think that if we limit it to the humanitarian organizations, we probably could provide for a larger grant amount, but then we would have to go through a vetting process as we get the
We
applications in.
just limit the chamber number? I don't know what a good number would be, Cliff.
$5,000 or $10,000.
That's what I'm thinking.
Have any of these chambers demonstrated their need? Have they presented anything to us
They're
other
right.
than just word of mouth saying we're going to run out of money at some point?
I think
I specifically reached out to the Northern Illinois Chamber.
Saying they're going to run out of money at some point. How do you quantify that into figuring out how to allocate this federal aid for those that are in need the most right now?
As honestly as I can, they don't know because the fundraisers that they would be having right now did not take place. So can we ask them for a projection or a forecast? Sure.
Are we going to also, let's get back to organizations. We need to have a recommendation to move on. Mr. McMahon, you want to address this?
But just as I hear the discussion on the aspect of chambers, the CARES Act, so what you've talked about is limiting this to expense reimbursement.
Right.
And so, loss of fundraising capabilities is similar to
Lost revenue, right.
lost future revenue. And so I'm concerned about how we would apply that and whether those expenses, they're not expenses, whether that future lost revenue would even be eligible. So I'm not saying that you can't exclude a chamber into this area. It's just that to be consistent, we would be looking at expenses that they incurred in the past or will incur
Before December 30th.
before December 30.
Right. That's right.
That was my point I was gonna raise too.
What if we just, because I think if I'm not mistaken, we're only talking $2 million right now. Is that our budget for not-for-profits?
Right.
I
So
think
it's
so.
not a huge amount, and there's some of those organizations I could see really funding them strongly. What if we what if we say not-for-profits providing direct humanitarian services, direct, to the people of King County, and what if we put the chambers under the business, let them apply under the business amount? I mean, it's a business support organization, but they would be,
I like that.
they would be right in that $5,000 to $20,000.
Right.
But that won't be enough money, but it recognizes their need.
I would think most chambers would be tickled pink to get $5,000.
You have to get them through the month.
All right, Mr. Hanson?
I'm more comfortable with that route if we are going to support the chambers with the understanding that we're not seeding a program that they're offering. These are
We have them under the same expense criteria that we would under the business program. So if we modified that, do you put a limit on chamber expenses? Or are you going to put them a max of $10,000?
10,000, yes.
All right. So we're going to add that, and then we're going to leave the 501c3s to humanitarian requirements. Ms. Thomas?
I just want to be on the record, I'm not in favor of including the chambers at this point.
Okay. All right. So noted. Ms. Wonicky?
Just a quick comment, as far as food shelters, many of them are hosted by churches, so I don't know if that's something you considered. I'm not saying to consider churches, but I think that might be something you're going to run into.
All right, but we're,
Mhm.
I know we dealt with this though at Riverboat, and those are all, we have criteria that we can use for the Riverboat application for this that would meet 501c3s. I think, so if we're going to limit the charitable request to humanitarian entities, then are we going to put a limit on the grant amount?
Or which one are we talking about? The not-for-profit?
The not-for-profit, no, there's going to be unlimited amounts, and then we're going to, okay, so there's two ways to approach this. I get, one is to have no limit and see what comes in, and then we're going to have to, if we have enough money and they all are satisfied, we can approve it. If we have more requests than available funds, then we have to go through a prioritization process where we'll meet and make recommendations.
I think there's just such a broad range, the homeless shelters. I could see being really generous to them, but I would say let them apply, and this is really a prime target for if we do have excess funds to come back.
Well, I think but putting some reasonable limit, because if one shelter, I mean, the Hesed House came in and made a proposal that was could have taken the whole program. And again, are we going to limit the expenses to what we talked about? We're not talking about building a new building. We're talking about expenses for PPE. Are we talking about the same expenses we used in the business grant program, or are we going to expand it beyond that? Ms. Thomas?
I agree with Mr. Frost. We should see what comes in. And I'm just going to go on the record. I mean, I've already advocated for Hesed House, but I think we need to put a lot of money toward the homeless shelters. I mean, we've got a moratorium on evictions until I think September 1st, but who knows how long the state may be able to continue that.
All right, so if the consensus is to not limit the application amount, what about the expenses that are eligible? Are we going to keep it in the same criteria that we have for the business grant program?
But if you eliminate capital projects,
right?
Like you said, they can't go out and build a new building, but got to think they have a pretty high percentage of their dollars reaching the end user.
Can I ask a question about that, since you've
specifically
mentioned capital projects, capital expenditures? The guidance from the Treasury does not speak specifically to capital, right? Either for or against. Is that correct?
I'm not
Most
sure.
recent guidance I've read.
Well, again, I think to be reasonable to have funds available for multiple entities because they have different needs, we have to have some limitation by limiting what the expenses are that are eligible for receiving funds. I think if we, for example, I'll use a Hesed House example. If Hesed House had to outplace their occupants because of COVID and they had a rent at a hotel rooms, rent is under our business criteria would be a permissible item for recovery. And I think that those are the costs that we're talking about. Extraordinary costs that didn't exist pre-COVID that are going to be funded. Obviously, a lot of PPE, a lot of cleaning supplies, that kind of thing. We're not talking about building a whole new homeless shelter. And I think that's where the distinction lies. And I think that's where, if you read the spirit of the guidelines from the federal government, you would find that that's the path that they are suggesting be taken. So if we have a facility that has been shut down, that had to be cleaned extremely, new ventilation system may be put in to accommodate the concerns, and had extraordinary rent payments because they had to outplace people, those would all fall within a permissible expense reimbursement. So are we comfortable leaving those same criteria in on the not-for-profits that we have on the business? Mr. Hanson?
I think capital project may be a little bit fuzzy for a couple of the homeless facilities. Much like a storefront or a restaurant, they're going to have to reconfigure some of the way they physically do things to be socially distant and to adhere to CDC guidelines. So, some of these partial rebuilds of an existing building is different than building a new building, but they're going to have different different costs that may still fall under the same umbrella as a brick and mortar business. But the whole, what's a capital project versus a reconfiguration so they can operate legally may be a little more expensive than.
All right, but we can sort
than
through that.
expense.
I would just say the emphasis we should place, given the limited resources we have, is that we stay consistent with that. And we can always reevaluate if we end up with extra funds.
I would concur with that.
Chairman Hoshite, this is Scott Berger.
Hi,
I'd
Scott.
like to make a comment. Hi,
Sure.
I think I'd suggest that we consult KEB on this matter regarding capital and get some additional guidance and get back to you on this.
All right, but if we didn't focus on the capital criteria and used what our grant criteria was for the business program, we would be okay, right, Scott?
Correct.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, could we still get that guidance because? I
Certainly,
think-
we should. Yes, I think we need it because of, as we sort through this, and if there are funds that are not requested, we may choose to allocate them to something capital in nature, and then we want to be prepared to know that there are funds that are available. You know, the other thing we got to keep in mind when we're talking about capital expenditures is those are not, they don't lend themselves to being invested in short-term time frame, and they've got to be invested before December 30th. Okay, I think that's the, so on the not-for-profit request time frame, well, can we do a model for that, Mr. McMahon, similar to the business model that we could bring back next week? Right. All right, the only other item for business today was the discussion of the allocation of, now putting on our county board hats for the county's allocation. We all received from Mr. Onzik a updated sheet with the non-payroll funding request details. And just for sake of discussion, we started with the county with roughly 37 million. We allocated, if I'm looking at this document on page 11, we allocated some money to non-payroll requests from the health department, and we approved by resolution some other requests. So now we have roughly, and is Mr. Onzik here or on the phone? As I understand it, we've got $19 million in available funding, and the projects that came through this list as approved have a total of roughly 28 million. So if my math is correct, we'd have to cut out roughly 9 million of the requests that are on this, that made it through as approved requests on our original form. So the task is that we have to go through this list and pare down what we want to pare down to a number that we're comfortable moving forward with. The goal of which would then be to approve another resolution, so we would be ultimately fully invested with our county funds and have all those allocated. So well, I'll open it up to discussion on that basis. The suggestion would be that what we could do, as we have done in the past, when we have lists like this and we want to pare it down, we had a procedure at Riverboat where the committee members would send in their priorities on a spreadsheet, and those would be averaged to come up with a recommendation for funding of which items would be taken into account. The other option would be to proportionately reduce the request for funding. However, some of these are all or nothing projects to the extent they're capital in nature. If we're going to put a generator at the building A, that's 250,000. If we only provide 200,000 in funding, then we can't put the generator in. So
We won't wire it, that's all.
right. We'll have Kenyon out there pulling the cord on it to
And we'll
start
have
it
a
every
farmer
time.
fix it. We'll be really.
Right. Or we could just focus on the big ticket items that are in here, and focus on those as priorities first, and then make a decision moving forward. But having given that background, I'll leave it up, open it up for discussion as the committee, how you want to deal with this. Mr. Frost?
What's our time? Is our goal to get this done before we leave today, or do we have some breathing room on this?
Well, I mean, we could either do it today, or we could set this over till next week. Now that we have the framework for not-for-profits and business intact, we could have the goal of next week's meeting just to pare this down.
I guess I'm just wondering if we could look at I can't do the math, but
Right.
We have X amount of money and you've asked for, if we came up a percentage and go back to the departments and say, look, I just think the departments are going to be more apt to tell me what is important to them than I am.
Right.
So, I'm thinking we send it back to them and say, look, you're going to have this amount of money. Tell us what's important to you and what isn't.
All right. Yeah, I think that we did some of that as we went through the list, because some of the items were withdrawn as being lesser priority than some of the other expenses, or some of the requests were funded by other resources. But if we have 20, it's about a third. We have 2/3 of the funds available. And so I think now we're in a situation where it would be competing between departments more than, well, some of the departments are very small requests, but what we're talking about here really is information technologies is a big department with requests, as is the sheriff. Those are really the two largest. Mr.
I think
Fossack?
I agree with Mr. Frost about the departments prioritizing what is most important, because I don't know that we have within our list of things the rank priorities. Certainly the connections and redundant connections for our offices, would have a priority over some of the other things that
Right.
were in there.
Well, I think in order to make the mark, we're going to have to cut out either building management, IT, or sheriff requests, because that's where the big ticket items are. So, and that's, the debate will be among them. Ms. Thomas?
So, I've been really thinking about these, some of these capital expenditures. I mean, obviously, we need, the IT equipment, because that is essential to staff performing their day-to-day duties. But some of these capital expenditures, like vehicle purchases, I really wonder about. And so I'll be curious to see what guidance comes back from the firm Director Berger is.
Right, I think Mr. Frost's suggestion is appropriate, and what I'd like to do is ask that the departments that have requested, that have made it through this list, that have projects on here, prioritize them in order. Now, if you only have one request, there's no prioritization necessary, but if we could ask that the department heads or the elected officials in charge of each area send Mr. Onzik this list back with a prioritization of 1 through whatever in terms of the expenditures, then we can look at that. And if we could get that by maybe Thursday of this week, so we have it before our next meeting, then we can come to the meeting and talk about what areas we may choose to defer. Now, one other thing, the requests, although made, still have to be vetted through the state's attorney's office and through our consultant to be as qualified for grants. So if some of those fell out, that may be another way that we get to the bottom line. But is the committee comfortable with approaching it that way? All right. All right, Mr. Sanchez.
I just have a question. Number 14, it's a development request, and I don't remember the conversation around this one, and I didn't put it on my notes. It's $403,000 ask. Did we approve that?
What page is that on?
It's on page 2, number 14, contractual services.
Can you, it's not on the list.
Wait,
that I
which
have.
list are you looking at? Sorry.
What is the description of the item?
We're looking at non-payroll.
Right.
Requests. It's contractual services for development. Possible, what is does it say? Data obtained will be used to make decisions and recommendations that will enable employees to return to work and students to
taken
return to
off.
school safety. We
Oh,
did
that
take
was
it out?
Qualtrics. Was that now under IT? Or no? Okay,
We took that off.
Did we take that out?
okay,
I can't remember.
all right. Well, we'll get an updated list with the exact numbers then. Can we do that? And in terms of communicating to staff, if Mr. Onzik isn't here, I'll call him and ask him to do that. But if we can get that message out as well, maybe through the Aviola, if you could maybe send that out as well to reinforce that, I'd appreciate that. All right, so having covered that issue, is there any further business for the committee today? Any questions from anyone that's online? Meeting next Monday at the same time, is that okay?
Yes.
All right.
Did we try Friday?
We're going to have, the state's attorney's got to get the program done, so we're going to need that time.
He's got this.
Pardon? The 24th at 2:30? I appreciate everyone being here. I know that the bulk of our work, at least for a period of time, is going to be done here fairly shortly. And then we'll have a lot more work as the applications come in. But I appreciate everyone taking the time to be here and participate. All right, entertain a motion to adjourn. Mr. Kenyon, Mr. Sanchez, all those in favor say aye. All right, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Hey, Matt, thanks for putting all that together.
Homeless population in Elton. Blowing out.